The morning David Matthews walked into the Riverside County Courthouse. His hands weren't shaking from the cold. October in California barely touched 40 degrees. But the tremor in his fingers came from something deeper, something that had been eating at him for 6 months, ever since he'd discovered what his brother had done. The courthouse steps were crowded with lawyers, defendants, and families torn apart by betrayal. David pulled his coat tighter and scanned the crowd, looking for the face he'd trusted his entire life. The face that had smiled at his wedding, the face that had promised, with tears in his eyes, that their father's construction business would live forever in their hands, the face that had forged his signature and stolen everything. David. The voice came from behind him, deep, familiar, carrying the same tone it had when they were kids playing catch in their mother's backyard. David turned slowly, and there was Marcus. Younger by 3 years, taller by 2 inches, and wearing a suit that probably cost more than David had made in the last 2 months. They stood 10 feet apart on the courthouse steps, two brothers who had built houses together, who had shared Christmas dinners and business dreams, who had once been each other's best man. Now they were about to face each other across a courtroom, with lawyers and judges deciding what remained of their shattered family. "You look good," Marcus said, his voice steady, but his eyes avoiding David's face. "The business treating you well?" David almost laughed. The business? The construction company their father had started with nothing but a truck and a tool belt in 1987. Matthews & Sons Construction, the company that had put both boys through college, that had bought David's house, that had seemed strong enough to support 2 families forever. The company that Marcus had systematically drained of $340,000 over 8 months. "There is no business anymore," David said quietly. "You know that." Marcus shifted his weight, glancing at the courthouse doors. "David, if we could just talk." "We tried talking." David's voice carried an edge now, the kind of sharpness that comes from sleepless nights and unanswered phone calls. "We tried talking when the bank called me about the loan you took out using my name. We tried talking when I found out you'd been transferring money to accounts I'd never heard of. We tried talking when you disappeared for 3 weeks without telling me where you were going. I was trying to fix it. By stealing more." A cluster of attorneys walked past them, their expensive shoes clicking against the concrete. One of them glanced back, recognizing the tension, the kind of family drama that filled courtrooms every day. Brothers suing brothers, sons fighting sons, love turning into litigation. "I never meant for it to get this far," Marcus said, finally meeting David's eyes. "I was going to pay it back." "With what money?" David stepped closer, his voice dropping to the kind of whisper you use when you are afraid of your own anger. "With the money you were spending on your girlfriend? With the money you were using to rent that apartment in Newport Beach?" Marcus's face went pale. "How did you?" "I hired a private investigator, Marcus. After 6 months of not knowing where my business partner disappeared to, I hired someone to find you." David pulled a manila folder from his coat. $1,400 a month for a beachfront apartment. Dinners at restaurants that cost more than our employees make in a week. Jewelry, purchases, hotel rooms. Marcus stared at the folder like it was a weapon. "David, you don't understand. I understand that you stole from me. I understand that you forged my signature on a business loan and used our father's company as collateral. I understand that while I was working 60 whore weeks trying to keep us afloat, you were living some kind of fantasy life with money that wasn't yours." The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the courthouse steps. David watched one catch against Marcus's shoe and stick there, like evidence that wouldn't go away. "What I don't understand," David continued, "is why my own brother would destroy everything our family built. What I don't understand is how you could look me in the eye every morning for 8 months knowing what you were doing." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. His hands, David noticed, were shaking now too. "Mr. Matthews? Mr. Matthews?" They turned to see a young woman in a navy suit walking toward them. David's attorney, Sarah Chen, someone he'd found through a referral service and paid with money he'd borrowed from his retirement fund. "We should head inside," she said, glancing between the brothers. "Judge Morrison runs a tight schedule." David nodded and started toward the courthouse doors. Behind him he heard Marcus's footsteps following, and for a moment it felt like they were kids again, walking to school together, watching each other's backs. That feeling lasted exactly until they walked into courtroom 3B. The room was smaller than David had expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired. Marcus sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who looked like he specialized in making guilty people appear sympathetic. David took his seat at the plaintiff's table and tried not to look at his brother. He focused instead on the judge's bench, on the American flag hanging beside it, on the court reporter setting up her equipment. He focused on anything except the memory of Marcus standing beside him at their father's funeral 3 years ago, both of them promising to honor the legacy they'd inherited. All rise for the Honorable Judge Morrison. Judge Morrison was a thin woman in her 60s with gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen every possible variation of human betrayal. She settled behind the bench and opened the case file. "This is a civil case. Matthews versus Matthews regarding allegations of fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty in connection with Matthews and Sons Construction." She glanced up at David, then at Marcus. "I've reviewed the preliminary motions and evidence. Miss Chen, you may begin with your opening statement." Sarah Chen stood up, straightening her jacket. She was young, maybe 30, but her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from believing in your case. "Your Honor, this is a story about trust, about 2 brothers who inherited their father's business and made a promise to protect it, about one brother who kept that promise and another brother who broke it in the worst possible way." She walked toward the jury box, even though there was no jury. In civil cases like this, the judge would decide everything. David Matthews trusted his brother with his signature, with access to company accounts, with the financial future of a business their father spent 30 years building. Marcus Matthews took that trust and used it to steal $340,000 from the company, forging his brother's name on loan documents and transferring money to personal accounts. David kept his eyes on the table in front of him, but he could feel Marcus looking at him from across the room. "But this isn't just about money, Your Honor. This is about a family business that employed 17 people. This is about contracts that couldn't be fulfilled, about suppliers who weren't paid, about a 33-year legacy that was destroyed by greed and betrayal." Sarah Chen paused, letting the words settle. "We will show that Marcus Matthews systematically looted the company over an 8-month period, that he used forged documents to obtain a $200,000 business loan, and that when confronted with evidence of his crimes, he disappeared rather than face the consequences of his actions." She returned to her table. "We ask this court to order full restitution, to hold Marcus Matthews accountable for the destruction he caused, and to send a message that family loyalty cannot be used as a shield for criminal behavior." David felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. For months, he'd wondered if anyone would believe him, if anyone would understand that this wasn't about money. It was about trust, about the promise 2 brothers had made to their dying father. Marcus's attorney stood up next. Richard Brennan looked like he'd been practicing law since before David was born, with perfectly styled silver hair and a manner that suggested he was about to explain why everything you thought you knew was wrong. "Your Honor, Marcus Matthews is guilty of poor judgment. He is guilty of making financial decisions without consulting his brother. He is guilty of desperation and panic when those decisions went wrong." Brennan paused, looking directly at David. but he is not guilty of theft, and he is certainly not guilty of the malicious betrayal his brother is alleging. David felt his jaw tighten. What we have here is a family business that was already in financial trouble, a business that was struggling to compete in a difficult construction market. When Marcus Matthews took out that business loan, he was trying to save the company, not destroy it. Brennan walked closer to the judge's bench. Yes, he should have consulted his brother. Yes, he should have been more transparent about the company's financial situation. But desperation is not theft, Your Honor. Poor communication is not fraud, and family disagreements, however painful, do not belong in criminal court. David stared at Marcus, who was looking down at his hands. We will show that every dollar Marcus Matthews accessed was used for legitimate business purposes, that his brother was aware of the company's financial struggles, and that this lawsuit is motivated more by personal animosity than by actual financial harm. Brennan returned to his table with the confidence of someone who'd made similar arguments hundreds of times before. Judge Morrison made a note in her file. Miss Chen, call your first witness. The plaintiff calls David Matthews. David walked to the witness stand, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. As he settled into the chair, he could see Marcus clearly for the first time since they'd entered the courtroom. His brother was watching him, and for a moment David saw something in his eyes that looked like regret. Or maybe it was just fear. Mr. Matthews, Sarah Chen began, please tell the court about Matthews and Sons Construction. David took a breath. Our father started the company in 1987. He was a carpenter who wanted to build custom homes, quality work that would last. When Marcus and I graduated college, we both joined the business. I handled project management and client relations. Marcus handled finances and business development. And how long did this partnership continue? Until January of this year, that is when I found out about the unauthorized loan. Tell the court about that discovery. David shifted in his seat. Even now, 6 months later, the memory felt like a punch to the stomach. I was at the bank making a deposit when the manager asked me about the $200,000 business loan we'd taken out the previous month. I told him there must be some mistake. We hadn't taken out any loans. He showed me the paperwork. My signature was on every document. But you hadn't signed those documents? I'd never seen them before. David glanced at Marcus. The signature looked like mine, but I knew I hadn't signed anything. When I got back to the office, I asked Marcus about it. He said he could explain, but he needed a few days to sort things out. He disappeared. Didn't come to work the next day or the day after that. I went to his apartment, but the landlord said he'd moved out suddenly. His phone went straight to voicemail. Sarah Chen walked closer to the witness stand. During this time, did you discover any other unauthorized transactions? David nodded, feeling the familiar anger rise in his chest. I spent 3 weeks going through every bank record, every account statement. Marcus had been transferring money out of the business accounts for months. Small amounts at first, 500 here, 1,000 there. By the end, he was taking 10,000 at a time. What was the total amount? $340,000. That was everything we had in reserves, plus the loan money he'd stolen using my forged signature. How did this affect the business? David paused, remembering the phone calls he'd had to make, the contracts he'd had to cancel. We couldn't pay our suppliers. We had to lay off 12 employees. 3 major construction projects had to be abandoned because we couldn't afford materials. And the company's current status. Matthews and Sons Construction filed for bankruptcy in March. 33 years of my father's work gone. The courtroom was quiet, except for the sound of the court reporter's fingers on her keyboard. David looked at Marcus and saw his brother's hands covering his face. Mr. Matthews, in your opinion, why did your brother take this money? Marcus's attorney stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation sustained, Judge Morrison said. Miss Chen, stick to facts the witness can verify. I'll withdraw the question. Sarah Chen returned to her table. No further questions. Richard Brennan approached the witness stand with the measured pace of someone about to dismantle everything David had just said. Mr. Matthews, you testified that you handled project management while your brother handled finances, is that correct? Yes. So Marcus was responsible for all banking relationships, loan applications, and cash flow management? David hesitated. He could see where this was going. He handled the day-to-day financial operations, but major decisions were supposed to be made together. But in practice, you trusted Marcus to handle the money, while you focused on construction and client relationships? We were partners. That is not what I asked. Did you regularly review bank statements, monitor cash flow, or participate in meetings with lenders? David felt the trap closing. No, but... So when Marcus told you the company was having cash flow problems, you trusted his judgment about how to handle those problems? He never told me we were having cash flow problems. Brennan paused, looking genuinely surprised. He never told you that the company had lost 3 major contracts in the fall of last year. David stared at him. What are you talking about? He never mentioned that your biggest client, Morrison Development, had terminated their contract in September? That is not. David started to say, then stopped. Morrison Development had been their largest account, worth nearly half their annual revenue. If they'd lost that contract, Mr. Matthews, were you aware that the company's operating expenses exceeded revenue for 4 consecutive months prior to the loan transaction? I know Marcus handled the books. Were you aware that the company owed $85,000 in unpaid invoices to suppliers? David felt something cold settle in his stomach. Marcus said we were having some collection issues, but... So when Marcus took out that business loan, the company was already in financial crisis, wasn't it? I don't know. Maybe. But he should have told me. And when he transferred money between accounts, he was trying to keep the company solvent while protecting you from the stress of the financial situation? Objection, Sarah Chen called out. Leading the witness, sustained. But the damage was done. David could see it in Judge Morrison's face, the slight shift in her expression that suggested the case wasn't as clear, cut as it had seemed 20 minutes ago. Brennan returned to his table, and David stepped down from the witness stand feeling like he'd just been in a car accident. Everything he thought he knew about the last year of the business was suddenly unclear. Sarah Chen called 3 more witnesses: the bank manager who'd discovered the forged signatures, the private investigator who'd tracked down Marcus, and David's accountant who testified about the missing money. But with each witness, Marcus's attorney chipped away at the narrative of simple theft, introducing the possibility that Marcus had been trying to save a failing business rather than destroy a successful one. When the plaintiff's case was finished, Judge Morrison called a recess. David walked outside, needing air and space to think. Sarah Chen followed him. He is good, she said, meaning Marcus's attorney. But we knew he would be. The forged signatures are still our strongest evidence. No matter what the company's financial situation was, Marcus didn't have the right to forge your name on loan documents. David nodded, but he was thinking about the contracts he'd apparently lost without knowing it, about the unpaid invoices Marcus had been juggling while David focused on construction sites and client meetings. Had he been a negligent partner? Had he left Marcus to handle problems that were too big for one person to solve? David? He turned to see Marcus walking toward him, his attorney nowhere in sight. Can we talk? Just for a minute. Sarah Chen stepped forward. I don't think that is a good idea. It is okay, David said. Give us a minute. She walked back toward the courthouse, leaving the brothers alone on the sidewalk. Marcus looked older than he had that morning, like the trial had aged him in real time. "I know you don't want to hear this," Marcus said, "but I never meant to hurt you. The business was falling apart, David. We were 3 months behind on payroll. Our biggest client had dropped us. I was trying to buy us time to turn things around. By forging my signature? By keeping us alive long enough to find new contracts to get back on our feet." Marcus ran his hands through his hair. "I know I should have told you how bad things were, but you were so stressed about the Patterson House project, and Mom was going through her chemo treatments. I thought I could fix it before you had to know." David studied his brother's face, looking for the lie, for the manipulation he'd convinced himself was there. "Where did the money go, Marcus? The investigator found receipts for restaurants, for jewelry, for Rebecca." The words hit David like cold water. Rebecca who? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking at the courthouse steps where families were saying goodbye before verdicts were read. Rebecca Chen. David felt the world tilt slightly. Chen was Sarah's last name. It was also the last name of David's wife. "Rebecca who, Marcus, David?" Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "I've been seeing Rebecca for 8 months. Rebecca Chen, Rebecca Matthews. David's wife of 7 years, the woman who'd consoled him through the stress of the business collapse, who'd held him while he cried about losing his father's legacy. The woman who'd been sleeping with his brother while he was working 60 weeks trying to save their company." David stood perfectly still on the sidewalk, watching cars drive past, watching people walk by with their normal problems and their intact families. He felt like he was underwater, like sound was reaching him from very far away. 8 months, he said finally. "David, I am sorry. 8 months, since January. Since December. Before the loan, before everything went wrong, I was going to tell you, before or after you stole my money. It wasn't like that." "What was it like?" David's voice was getting louder, and people were starting to stare. "What was it like? Marcus? Were you planning this together? Was she helping you figure out how to forge my signature? She doesn't know about the money. Rebecca doesn't know anything about the business. But she knew she was sleeping with my brother." Marcus didn't answer. David looked at his brother, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The man who'd taught him to throw a curveball, who'd been his best man, who'd cried with him at their father's funeral. The man who'd been sleeping with his wife while stealing his money and destroying everything their family had built. "All rise. Court is now in session." The bailiff's voice carried from the courthouse steps. The afternoon session was starting. "We should go in," Marcus said. David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They walked back into the courthouse together, two brothers who would never be brothers again, no matter what the judge decided. The afternoon proceeded like a dream David couldn't wake up from. Marcus took the witness stand and testified about the company's hidden financial problems, about his desperate attempts to save jobs and contracts. He admitted to poor judgment, to panic, to making decisions he should have made with David. He did not mention Rebecca. Marcus's attorney called witnesses who testified about the construction industry's struggles, about the contracts that had been canceled, about the impossible situation Marcus had been trying to navigate alone. But David barely heard any of it. He kept thinking about Rebecca coming home late from work dinners, about the new clothes she'd been buying, about the way she'd comforted him when Marcus disappeared, about the way she'd asked just last week if he was really sure he wanted to go through with the lawsuit. When the testimony was finished, Judge Morrison announced that she would render her decision in 2 weeks. David walked out of the courthouse in a daze. Sarah Chen was talking about appeals and restitution, but her words felt meaningless. Marcus had disappeared again, probably back to Rebecca, probably to plan whatever came next. On the courthouse steps, David pulled out his phone and called his wife. "How did it go?" Rebecca's voice was warm, concerned, exactly the way it had been for months, while she was betraying him. "We need to talk," David said. "Of course, I'll make dinner. You must be exhausted." "We need to talk about Marcus." The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. 2 weeks later, Judge Morrison ruled that Marcus had indeed committed fraud and ordered him to pay restitution of $240,000, less than the full amount, acknowledging the company's prior financial difficulties. But by then, David barely cared about the money. Marcus and Rebecca had disappeared the day after the trial ended. David's attorney said they could pursue criminal charges, could try to garnish wages or seize assets. But Marcus was good at disappearing, and Rebecca had cleaned out their joint savings account before she left. David sat in the empty office of Matthews and Sons Construction, surrounded by 33 years of family history, his father's tools, project photos, the first dollar they'd ever earned framed on the wall. In 2 weeks, the landlord would change the locks and everything would be thrown away. He thought about the day his father had brought him and Marcus to this office as kids, showing them blueprints and explaining how families built things together that lasted for generations. He thought about trust and how quickly it could be broken. He thought about his brother somewhere with his wife, starting a new life with money that wasn't theirs and love that wasn't real. Outside, it was getting dark. David locked the office door and walked to his truck, which would probably be repossessed by the end of the month. As he drove home to his empty house, he realized that some betrayals are so complete, so thorough, that justice becomes irrelevant. The judge had spoken, but no one in that courtroom felt it was over.